In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, unto whom all hearts be opened, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of thy Holy Spirit, that we may perfectly love thee and worthily magnify thy holy name. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. All right, well, thank you to everybody who's tuning in today, this morning, for the re-record of the second session of the St. Paul's Ministry of Defense. The first session got cut off because we started late, because the 5 p.m. Mass got out towards the end of the hour, and so here we are again, and I wasn't on point, so now we have a chance to kind of do it right. So we'll jump into things today. If you remember from last week, the topic of last week was an introduction to apologetics. So kind of, what is apologetics? What is the art or the discipline of defending the faith? What are the different branches of apologetics? So what are the different ways you can defend the faith? But primarily my goal was to just demonstrate the importance of it, like why it's actually needed in culture, how it's helpful on the individual level, how it's helpful for evangelism and discipleship, and how it's helpful for increasing your confidence in the faith. And we also talked about the relationship between faith and reason. So what is actually the basis for our belief? Do we believe because of arguments and evidence? Or do we believe because of emotion? Do we believe because of the Holy Spirit? How do all those forces play a role in determining why we actually believe in the gospel and in Christ's church? But today, we're going to be talking about the benefits of belief, so the actual ways that it makes your life better to be a believing Christian, and in fact, the absurdity of life without God. So why, in fact, life becomes incomprehensible if God doesn't exist and if Jesus isn't real. So this is important because imagine you're in a scenario where you're inviting a friend of yours to Mass. Let's say you've never talked about religion with him before, and he asks you, I don't really need to go to Mass. My life is fine how it is now. What would you just say to that? What would you say to that person? Even if they aren't like a total degenerate who are just like kind of ruining their lives and like drinking away their life or anything like that. What if they are just like a normal person who's doing the right thing? Let's say they have a long-term relationship, they're doing good at school, they're a productive member of society. How do you actually get them to take the faith seriously? How do you actually get them to care? It's been observed that the biggest obstacle to the gospel in today's culture is not, in fact, objection, right? If you think about it, how many people, when you ask them, okay, why aren't you going to Mass every Sunday? Why aren't you hitting holy hours every day? Like, why are you not loving Jesus with all your heart right now? The typical response you're going to get is not something like, because the epistemic problem of natural suffering is too strong, right? Or because the existence of abstract entities poses a threat to divine aseity, and so I can't believe in an omnipotent God, right? It's like, you're not actually going to hear that from a lot of people, right? It turns out that a lot of people are not Christians, not out of objection, but out of apathy. They just don't care enough about religious matters. Many of them don't take life seriously, but even the ones who do take life seriously and who are like decent people, they just don't know what difference this actually is going to make in their life. And so the point of this talk is to decisively demonstrate the difference that God makes and why you should want to actually believe. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how do we address the apathy part. And then the whole remainder of the course over the year will be addressing the objection part and actually making the rational case for Catholic Christianity. But today we're going to answer how we combat the not caring. And I hope that what we'll talk about today, will be a good remedy for that. And this investigation is important. Why we should care about whether or not God exists is because in a universe with a hidden God, where God's existence isn't obvious to us, then why we should even want to believe in him, or like how that would change our lives, should logically be raised prior to making that decision to give your life to him. And evangelical situations, it's like at the end of the day, it's like if we're not even seeing this God, but yet he's asking us to worship him and come in a relationship with him, and we don't have direct evidence for him, then it doesn't make sense to ask, how does this actually change our lives? And so that's why the question is important. Also, we talked last time about the difference between epistemic and pragmatic justification for belief. We'll recap that at the end of this lesson. after we go over the reasons why we should want it. But two, the investigation today is going to really lower the epistemic bar for Christian belief, right? So when you're trying to bring somebody to Christ, oftentimes they're going to say, I need a lot of evidence, right? I need really powerful reasons for thinking that this is true, because you're asking me to give up a lot. You're asking me to give up all these different pleasures. You're asking me to give up my time. It's the Christian life, it costs, right? You're supposed to count the cost, and it's not easy at many times. And so, especially if you're coming from a secular perspective, you can kind of think that Christianity is just about a bunch of no's, and it takes a lot from you. And so then, okay, if I'm going to give up the stuff, I want to be pretty sure that I'm giving it up for something that's real. And so it's called the epistemic bar. So that bar for belief is so high for them. You need to cross that threshold. But what this talk today is going to do is it's going to give you the ammunition to lower that epistemic bar for people. You're going to make it so that they're going to actually need as little reasons or evidence as possible to come to Christ, just because they want to be there with him. They want to believe so badly. So that's, again, another goal for today. So first, we'll talk about the sociological and the worldly benefits of believing in God and of being a Christian, and then we'll get into the more personal and the more philosophical. So we'll talk about the difference that God makes on the societal level. So firstly, belief in God and in the Judeo-Christian revelation is very important for the founding principles of a free country like the United States, especially a country that's built on the premise of all men being created equal and having rights. Like we say, we have rights to different things. We have rights to freedom, to live our lives how we want, so long as we don't transgress the freedom of or safety of other people. We have the right to life, to not be killed while we're innocent. We have the right to happiness and bodily autonomy and all these different things. But then there's a question of, where do our rights actually come from? Do they come from the government? Is it just, secular Thomas Jefferson coming up with these values, just pulling them out, or getting them from John Locke 300 years ago, and that's the basis of them? A lot of secular people think that we get our rights from what's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a document that comes out of the United Nations after World War II. It comes out in the 40s, 50s era, and they basically pronounce that all human beings have certain rights and are not to be trifled with. And a lot of secular people will point to that and say, look at this. This shows that we have rights. But it's like, okay, so did we not have rights before the 1950s? And what happens if the United Nations, all the governments of the world come together and if the next century then reverse that, right? We have no idea what mankind is going to look like in the future. And so the idea is that if our rights to all these things that we hold so valuable and hold so dear are actually given to us by the government and not from God, then that means the government can also take them away. If the government is their source, they can also withdraw them, which is a really scary thought. But the idea here is, and the whole point of the Declaration, is that we are created, we're not accidents, and we have these rights because they're endowed to us by our Creator. And so the idea here is that no man can take away what God has given us. And so no matter how powerful the government is, they're not the source of our rights, our fundamental rights. They come from God, and so no matter what, they have to respect free will, and they can never take them away. Right? They can never actually take away our rights. That's a point that Bishop Barron makes quite frequently. Also, too, the difference that God makes on this sociological level, it changes the behavior of the population, of the citizenry. So we know that, for example, giving to charity, right? The biggest predictor of how much money one gives to charity is religiosity. So charitable giving to organizations of all kinds, not just churches, is directly proportional to one's level of religiosity, to how faithful one is. Whether or not one adopts, right, is also greatly influenced by religiosity. So Christians are twice as likely to adopt as are secularists. They're also more likely to have more kids too, so they're kind of adding an additional burden on top of it. Also crime too, right? Obviously it shouldn't come as a surprise that if you're more religious, you're going to be less likely to commit crime, right? So imagine a scenario where you're in the dark. Let's say you're coming out of a friend's house. It's like 11 p.m. and you see kind of two big guys walking towards you in your direction. And, it's nighttime. They're two big guys. You're a little scared. Would your emotions change? Would you feel differently if you knew that those two guys were coming out of a Bible study. I think pretty clearly, right? All of a sudden you'd feel a lot safer. So even on an emotional level too. But the data suggests this as well, that crime goes down as religiosity goes up. And then I think too, we've seen a recent descent into cultural degeneracy at many levels because of a lack of faith in the country. So for example, intersectional politics. So this idea of breaking down the citizens and breaking down the American people on all these identity lines. For example, like we've got black and white Americans, male and female, gay and straight, trans and cis, and then everything else, rich and poor, and all these things, and then they're kind of dividing that, and then building party platforms and building coalitions based on that. And it's not really respectful of our common human dignity. I think it's taken advantage of more on one side of the aisle, but you definitely do see it tapped into in both. But it doesn't respect universal human dignity, and it pits people against each other. And it gives people the idea that their fundamental identity is rooted in things where it ought not be, right? There's a huge contingent of the population that associates their identity with their sexual orientation, which would be crazy a number of years ago. But the only way that we can truly be happy is if our identity is rooted as sons and daughters of God. Anything else is fleeting and finite and unfulfilling. I think the sexuality agenda, right, very clearly of the church of the country is not in line with what the church teaches. The American public disagrees with the church on most moral teachings. They still agree with us on adultery and polygamy. Those two issues still poll in the single digits in approval surveys, but everything else is in the high 70s, 80s, and even 90s, whether it's contraception, IVF, gay marriage, divorce, everything else. And so we've really lost the country on the sexual issues, which is really sad because that's a major obstacle to the gospel for a lot of people. Amongst young people, that's cited as the second most frequent instance or objection to the Christian faith, according to data collected by Word on Fire. And then this is interesting too. It's something that isn't often mentioned, but you see an elevation of animal worth amongst the secular culture, right? So now all of a sudden, human beings are no longer the crown of creation. They're no longer the pinnacle. They're no longer the ends, and everything else is at least partly a means. And you see this too with surveys. So they've done lots of different surveys and polls on this, and I've seen it done in classes of mine too, where they'll ask young people this very interesting question. They'll ask them, if you're walking by a pond and your dog is drowning and there's a stranger drowning, you only have time to save one, which one are you going to save? And the vast majority of young people say they would save the dog, which is insane. They're going to save their dog over a human person because animals matter just as much as human beings, right? And that's a scary thought. Now, who knows if they would actually do that in the moment, but the fact that they hold that view and they claim, at least on an intellectual level, that they do it, is indicative of how much or how little they value human life. And you can think about this too in the abortion question too. How do you square the idea that we can't kill chickens for food, but we can kill small human beings, right? How do you square those two things? It's incoherent, but it's this elevation of animal worth to the level of humans, and sometimes more so. And I think that's had effects on society too. Now, God also makes a huge difference on the personal level. We'll kind of run through these so we can get to the real meat of the talk, but happiness is tied with higher levels of religiosity. So in general, the more religious you are, the happier you are. I remember actually learning about this in my secular psych class, my first semester of college, and my psych professor was a really nasty atheist. He was just really mean-spirited towards religious people. Now, he was also really lazy, so he wouldn't create his own lecture slides. They were already pre-made from the company that made the textbook, so he'd present those slides, and we learned this in the textbook. They mentioned this fact in the textbook when we did our happiness unit, and he was so anti-religious, he's so militantly atheist, that when we got to the slide, he read off all the things that makes you happy, and he skipped over the bullet point with religion. He literally skipped it over when it was on the slide. But whether, the secular professors like it or not, happiness is tied to having a relationship with God. That's how God designed reality, so it's not that surprising. Religious people also tend to live longer. They tend to get divorced less and have happier marriages when they are married. They tend to have less depression and anxiety and are better at coping with it. When they do encounter it, they're also better at coping with stress. They're less likely to commit suicide. They're less likely to become addicted to drugs. And if you do become addicted to drugs and alcohol, faith dramatically helps in your recovery. So the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, have studied people who've gone through rehab programs, and they've polled the people afterwards about what worked and what didn't in the program, and 84% of patients at the end of the program expressed a desire for a greater spiritual component to the program. 84%. And we know that amongst the people who adopted the spiritual practices recommended in those programs, they were significantly less likely to fall back into those old habits. So it really helps in that aspect of life too. And religious involvement and spirituality are furthermore associated with better health outcomes too, right? Just having that sense of hope in an afterlife and that deep peace can actually lead to a greater chance of recovery as well. And then finally too, now this is purely correlational, there's no causal connection at all that we can draw from this one, but religious university students tend to have higher GPAs too. So on average, a religious student will have a 13% higher GPA than a secular student. So I said during the main talk, we were not going to get as many laughs this time, but Andrew Hull should have been a little bit more religious during his time in college, and then maybe he would have seen better results. Now we'll get to some more philosophical stuff, but we'll start light and then we'll get deep. So I'm sure many of you guys have heard of something called Pascal's wager. So Pascal is the founder of modern probability theory. He was a French mathematician from the 17th century. And he converts to Christianity in his early 20s, and then he sets out to defend the Christian faith. And one of the things he sets out to do is to show that probabilistically and pragmatically and practically, it makes better sense to live your life as a Christian if certain conditions are met. So he's imagining someone who's in between Christian theism and atheism. So they're going back and forth between God doesn't exist or God exists and Jesus is God and I'm thinking about giving my life to him. So kind of that dichotomy. And that's the dichotomy that I think is most relevant in the Western world, even today in the United States, right? You don't really see a lot of Hindus or Buddhists or Muslims or anything like that. It's primarily going to be Christians and secularists in the Western world. And so for Pascal, he's imagining making the decision of how to live your life as a sort of probability calculus. And it's a game, right? But the thing is that we're born into the game. You're already playing it. There's no choice. So it's just a matter of how well you're going to play it and what your next move is going to be. But you don't get a choice whether or not to play it because you didn't choose to be born. So he's asking, what are you going to do with your life? So imagine there's two things you can do with your life. You can live your life as a Christian, you can give yourself to God, or you can live your life as an atheist and kind of live for this world. Live for the next world or live for this one, right? Those are your two choices. Now, one of those two things is going to be true. So what happens if you take each of these actions? Let's say that you choose to believe in God and live your life as a faithful Christian. What happens if God doesn't exist? Then it's well, okay, what did you lose and what do you gain? You lost the finite temporary pleasures of sin. That's all you lost. But the cool thing too is that if you believe all those studies that we just talked about, on balance, that could actually make up for the loss and the pleasures of sin, right? So it may even be that you kind of lose nothing on a net level. But let's just say you lose the pleasures of sin. You for sure lose that if you're doing the Christian life right. Then what do you gain, if it's true? You gain infinity. You gain an eternal relationship with a loving God. You gain life in the Trinity. Now what happens if Christianity is false? God doesn't exist. Well, you've lost the pleasures of sin, and you don't really gain much. So whether or not God actually exists, if you make the decision to believe in him and to be a faithful Christian, you only really have much to gain and you have little to lose. Now, what happens if you decide not to believe in God and you live your life for this world? What do you have to gain? Imagine if God doesn't exist, if Christianity is false. Well, what you have to gain is the pleasures of sin, right? You get to have sex before marriage. You get to do drugs. You get to keep all your money. You get to amass a lot of wealth and then everything else. So you get the finite pleasures of sin. But what happens if Christianity is false? Then it's okay, then you die, and then that's it, right? So if it's false, you just kind of die, and then you never even knew, number one, that it was false, right? So it's you never actually knew that you had it wrong. But what happens if atheism is false? What happens if God does exist, and you lived your life as if he didn't? then you lose infinity. You lose a relationship with heaven since you decided to live selfishly and for yourself. And so you don't really have much to gain, just the finite pleasures of sin, but you lose eternity. And so Pascal is thinking that if you do this simple probability calculus, the prudent man, the rational man, is going to choose to believe. Because on balance, that's a better decision. You have much more to gain and much less to lose. So it makes sense to believe and live your life as a Christian. Now, I think this argument really goes through under those parameters that Pascal sets up, namely that you're kind of 50-50 between the two worldviews. But I think he was even modest in that. I think it's like undeniable under that framework. But I think he's even too modest. Imagine it's like you reframe it and you make it more ambitious, right? Like let's say, for example, that you are just meeting with someone at the bar and it's just purely like, okay, secular worldview or like something broadly religious, right? Then it's like, I still think this wager makes sense. Now, if you broaden it to that level, then the number one objection you'll get is called the many gods objection. So this is the idea that like, okay, like you're asking me to like give myself over to your God. Well, why your God and not any of these other gods? So it's called the many gods objection. How you know which God to give yourself to. But then you're gonna be like, okay, well, let's narrow it down. Let's show that like philosophically God has to be this way. He has to be a perfect being. And so that's going to rule out all the polytheistic ones. And so you're left with monotheism and then evidence for the resurrection, then you're down to this. So it's basically Christianity against anything else. But then it's like you kind of got to that original situation that Pascal was getting to. So, but I think it's still a helpful thought experiment to get people to actually care about religion. But then there's been kind of a modernized form of Pascal's wager that was developed by the Catholic philosopher Alexander Proust, and then I've modified it a little bit. Imagine you're watching the news one day, or imagine you're not watching the news, you're just living your life. But then it turns out that an asteroid has shifted courses and is heading towards Earth. And it's going to wipe out all intelligent life on Earth. It's going to be a cataclysmic event. And in 60 minutes, the whole world is going to end. And there's going to be no human beings in 60 minutes from right now. What do you do in that last hour? Do you go have sex? Do you go play video games? What would you do if you were smart? Well, it's pretty obvious. If you're smart, you're going to get in line for confession, right? That's going to be the thing you're going to do because eternity is on the line. You know, you're about to die. You don't have a lot of time. You have a finite amount of time, and then there's eternity that you could either spend with God or without him. So you're going to spend that last bit of your life getting right with God. You're not going to care about those pleasures because they're so short-lived. And what you're potentially giving up to indulge in them is long-lived. It's everlasting, in fact. And so if you're prudent, if you're wise, you're going to go and do that, right? You're going to get right with God. Now, let's apply that to our lives now. Well, the world may not be ending in 60 minutes, but we know that our lives are going to end relatively soon, right? In the face of eternity, 60 minutes and 7 years is really not different from each other, right? That number just gets smaller and smaller in the face of infinity. And so it's like, you should be living your life in a way that sets you up for the next life. You know, I get that the pleasures are great. I get that they feel really nice, but it's like eternity is so much longer. It's so much greater. How could you sacrifice something that's everlasting for something that's so short-lived? Now, the only objection that somebody could give to that line of reasoning is that, yeah, I agree with the basic premise there, but that chance of an everlasting, heaven or hell is just so minuscule that you might as well just live it up now because most likely that's all the existence you're going to get. So just have a good time now. You don't really need to worry about that, right? You remember that, well, you may remember in the UK in the early 2000s, the new atheists, they spent millions of dollars on these advertisements that they put on all the buses in London. And it basically said, God probably doesn't exist, so just enjoy your lives, right? That kind of line of reasoning there. So that's the only thing they can say. But anybody who says that, honestly, just has not dealt with the arguments for Christianity. Because anyone who has is going to know, even if they ultimately disagree, the evidence is not minuscule. This is taken very seriously. For example, people like Joseph Smith, philosopher at Princeton, he says their arguments and evidence for and against God are roughly counterbalanced. So we're talking about a 50-50 chance. And even amongst most secular philosophers, so they don't believe in God, the vast majority of them still admit that there is evidence for God's existence. They just either think it's not enough for them, or maybe even the evidence against counterbalances that. But still, the fact that there is evidence for it, at the very least, and I actually think probabilistic evidence for it, shows that this needs to be taken seriously. Even if there was like a 10% chance, you would still spend that last 60 minutes getting right with God. So it doesn't matter even if you think it's a low chance. The problem is it's not that low. And if you think it's that low, then you got to deal with the arguments. And then you'll see pretty quickly that it's not that low. So I think that's also helpful to tell people. And if you want to get really ambitious, you can kind of give people the classic, if you were to die right now, would you go to heaven or hell? Right? That has worked with some people, but probably not a great starting point for most people. But still, if you can present Pascal's wager in a way that's, intelligent and warm, and then also welcoming too, because that's the thing with Pascal. He doesn't just beat this down people's throats. It's like he's using this as an invitation. So he says, if you're a secularist and you encounter this and you agree, yeah, it's the wise move to start living this life. But how do I begin? How do I make myself believe? Because you can't make yourself believe at the end of the day. And Pascal's suggestion to that person is to jump into the Christian life, right? Get involved in Christian fellowship, join a Bible study, start going to Mass, start doing all of these things. And so it's a great way to invite people in, right? So when people are not caring, this is a great way to get them to care. But now we're going to get to the meat of the lecture today. And this is going to take us until the end of our session today. But this is a philosophical analysis of life and of human experience, what it means to be human if God doesn't exist. So I identify 5 fundamental questions of life. So these are origin, so where did I come from? Identity, who am I? Morality, what's right and wrong? How should I conduct myself and live my life? Meaning, what's my purpose? What's the reason for why I exist? And then destiny. Where am I going when I die? Am I going anywhere? So these are the 5 fundamental questions of life. They penetrate the heart of human experience. To answer these questions is to answer what it means to be human. And they're inescapable. Questions like, who am I? What's the reason for why I'm here versus not here? You can't ever escape those questions. They're equally relevant to all people in all walks of life, rich or poor, intelligent or unintelligent, literate or illiterate, sick or healthy, old or young, right? It just doesn't matter. These questions are equally relevant to everyone. But of course, you might think that the answer to these questions is going to depend on your worldview. And you'd be exactly right in thinking that. So let's examine the human predicament without God, and then see how the answers to those questions play out if we assume a reality, a world where God doesn't exist. And so now I'm going to read a little bit from The Man, from William Lane Craig, from his chapter, The Absurdity of Life Without God. And we'll only read about less than a page, so it won't take too long. But this is what he writes. So imagine a world without God. Who am I? Man asks. Why am I here? Where am I going? Since the Enlightenment, when modern man threw off the shackles of religion, he has tried to answer these questions without reference to God. But the answers that have come back were not exhilarating, but dark and terrible. You are the accidental byproduct of nature, a result of matter plus time plus chance. There is no reason for your existence. All you face is death. Modern man thought that when he had gotten rid of God, he had freed himself from all that repressed and stifled him. Instead, he discovered that in killing God, he had only succeeded in orphaning himself. For if there is no God, then man's life becomes absurd. If God doesn't exist, then both man and the universe are inevitably doomed to death. Man, like all biological organisms, must die. With no hope of immortality, man's life leads only to the grave. His life is but a spark in the infinite blackness, a spark that appears, flickers, and then dies forever. Compared to the infinite stretch of time, the span of man's life is but an infinitesimal moment, and yet this is all the life that he will ever know. Therefore, everyone must come face to face with what the theologian Paul Tillich has called the threat of non-being. For though I know now that I exist, that I'm alive, I also know that someday I will no longer exist, that I will no longer be, that I will die. This thought is staggering and threatening, to think that the person I call myself will cease to exist, and that I will be no more. And the universe, too, faces the death of its own. You see, scientists tell us that the universe is expanding, and the galaxies are growing further and further apart. And as they do so, the universe grows colder and colder, and its energy is used up. Eventually, all the stars will burn out, and all matter will collapse into dead stars and black holes. There will be no light at all. There will be no heat. There will be no life. Only the corpses of dead stars and galaxies, ever expanding into the endless darkness and the cold recesses of space, a universe in ruins. This is not science fiction. The entire universe marches irreversibly toward its grave. So not only is the life of each individual person doomed, the entire human race is doomed. The universe is plunging towards inevitable extinction. Death is written throughout its structure. There is no escape. There is no hope. And there's obviously a lot more to be said about this, but that's the story of reality of mankind without God. You know, where do we come from, right? Remember that question of origin? We are accidental collocations of atoms. We're just electrochemical machines, just primates that were spat out and coughed up by a combination of blind, pitiless, indifferent chemical and physical processes. We're cosmic accidents. We're just dust at the end of the day. We're all just matter in motion. We're just a particular arrangement of matter in motion, just like any other material body in the universe. And so we're here by accident. There's nobody that cared for us. There's nobody that loved us into being. We're just here by accident, just like all of the other trillions of species that have existed over the last few billion years. And that's all we ultimately are, just 80-kilogram arrangements of atoms. There's no soul. There's no love. Even love is like just another chemical phenomenon, right? That's all love is on secular worldview. It's just chemical reactions in the brain. It's not a choice. It's not will. It's not something special. And so our lives really kind of seem meaningless, right? Because it's like we also, not only do we have no origin, at least no good origin, we also have no destiny. Our destiny is a return to the dust. That's what we've got on atheism. And you can't just say that, like, okay, well, I may be dying and then I'm gonna pass out of existence, but I can at least use my existence, my time, to help other people. Because the same fate is what they have in store, right? Because humanity is doomed to extinction as well. It's not just each individual. We're individually and collectively doomed to perish in a relatively short amount of time. So you've got infinity on one side, and all the billions of years before us, and then whatever was before that. Then you have humanity that comes on the picture for a little bit, for a few years, dies out, and then you've got infinity on the other side. So then you can ask, like, what's the point of our lives, right? Do we have any purpose anymore? Do we have any meaning? Well, to say that something's ultimately meaningful is to say that it has an impact, that it makes a difference. But if the result is the same thing no matter what, then we can't really say that anything that we do is ever ultimately meaningful, right? Like imagine if you had an exam the next morning, you stayed up late at night, and you grinded for hours, but you were really tired. And so when you wake up, you get ready to take the test, you don't remember anything you studied. Can you really say that like that pursuit was meaningful? Definitely not ultimately, because you didn't retain any of that. It made no ultimate difference. But that's exactly what happens with our lives here. Think about all the discoveries, all the cures for diseases, all the sacrifices, all the relationships, all the friendships, everything else. It doesn't actually change the end outcome, which is death, which is nothingness, which is just blackness, right? That's all that awaits us, is just nothingness. And I can't escape that no matter what. I imagine this life, it's just this absurd experience of waking up one day, being strapped down to the front end of a bullet train that's heading straight towards a dead end. And no matter what, you can't stop it. No matter how much you squirm, no matter how much you try to get loose, it's coming. Your death is coming. There's nothing you can do to stop it. And that's exactly what our lives are like. And worst case scenario too, and that example, it's like you're blindfolded too, because that moment, that dead end could happen at any time, and you have no idea. And so it's like we can't actually change that. No matter what happens, it's just all absurd. You know what I mean? And so we have to ask ourselves, why are we actually doing anything? Why do we do anything? It becomes, on the atheistic framework, like it seems like we're just doing anything we do just to entertain ourselves, just to make sure we don't get bored, or maybe to maybe alleviate a little bit of suffering too, so we cannot be miserable. But is that really the purpose of life? Is just to, put on a show for ourselves and just entertain ourselves? Why do we do anything? It's just killing time. The atheist comedian Bill Maher, that's how he put it. He's an atheist, he doesn't believe in an afterlife. And you know how he describes life? We're all just killing time until we die. It's a really depressing view. And it's not surprising then, looking at all this, why religious people tend to be happier. This is a depressing view. Think about it, for example, if you found out definitively that God didn't exist. Let's say they came out with a proof, and also we found a box dating to the 1st century with a bunch of bones, and it said, "Here lies Jesus the Nazarene." And everyone agreed, this is him. Imagine life. It becomes insane. It becomes absurd. What are we all doing? It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense. And no matter what we do, it doesn't make a difference. We're just filling our lives with temporary pleasures. So life becomes meaningless, becomes purposeless. There's no hope, right? Imagine it's all the bad stuff in the world, all the shootings, all the violence, the assassinations, and even not just the big stuff, but the local stuff too, right? All the betrayals, all the struggles and everything else. And it's there's no light at the end of all that. There's no good to redeem it all. That's just life. There's also no justice too. All the bad stuff that goes on, there's no punishment for that. It's just everyone kind of gets away scot-free, right? Hitler gets away scot-free. Killers get away scot-free. It's that's also depressing as well. And so people have realized that life kind of becomes absurd without God. So let's answer these questions again really quickly. What's our origin? A random multitude of blind, pitiless processes accidentally spat you out. You are, fundamentally, an 80-kilogram arrangement of atoms. You're an electrochemical machine. You're a slightly advanced primate. There is no good or love. It's all just different arrangements of chemicals and matter and energy. There's no purpose for why you exist. You're a cosmic accident that can affect no change, either of your life or the species. And all you face is extinction. The same forces that accidentally coughed you up are going to swallow you back again soon in a relatively short amount of time. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. And so think about the idea of sacrifice on this picture. Imagine the Captain Michael Mansour, right? The soldier who is with his sniper unit. There's a grenade that gets thrown onto the roof, and he jumps on the grenade to save his fellow comrades, giving up his own life to do that. It was all for nothing, right? Imagine this example that happened a number of years ago. There's an airplane that crashed into the water briefly after takeoff, and it's sinking, and they've got a rope thrown down, the rescue officers, and they need people to climb the rope to get out of the water before they drown. And you have one man who's standing there by the rope, letting everyone else go up. And by the time he gets the chance to go up, it's too late, and he drowns to death. But he gives up his life for all those people. On this view of the world, he was an absolute idiot. What he did makes zero sense, because all you get is this life. It's finite existence. There's no meaning, there's no morality. You don't need to go and do that. In fact, you did a stupid thing to do that, because you should be maximizing your own pleasure, getting as much out of these few decades as you can get. So sacrifice also, too, becomes absurd and incomprehensible. So it's all the things that we hold dear, they're all just illusions on this world. Now, some atheists might tell you, well, I think that you can have subjective meaning. You can create your own meaning. That's what a lot of them will say. It's not that life is meaningless without God. You can just create your own meaning. But I think you can have the illusion of meaning. It doesn't mean it actually is meaningful. For example, there's a famous thought experiment in philosophy where you have a guy who's really passionate about studying how to talk to cucumber plants. That's his whole thing. He spends his whole life researching how to communicate with cucumber plants. Obviously, they don't even have the biological mechanisms necessary for speech. So it's a fruitless endeavor. It can never go anywhere. But what if that guy really enjoys it? And what if he really derives this experiential meaning from it? We're not going to say that's a worthwhile endeavor. We're not going to say you actually have a meaningful existence. No, it's meaningless what he's doing. It's going to make no difference. He can't actually get anywhere with it, even if he's feeling that way. So it's like, you can't actually have a subjective meaning to life. There's either objective meaning, either you're making a difference, you're having an impact, or you're not. And you can't get that if we're all going to die. You can't change the outcome. Now, it's not just Christian apologists saying this. Let's take a look at some quick quotes of what some atheists have said. Think about what Richard Dawkins says about the human predicament. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. We'll skip the Nietzsche quote. Here's Jean-Paul Sartre. Life has no meaning the moment you lose the illusion of being eternal. Also, that God does not exist, I cannot deny. That my whole being cries out for God, I cannot forget. Now, this is the most powerful quote by any atheist on the ridiculousness of life without God. So just sit with this. That man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving. That his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. That no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. That all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Nobody has ever said it better than that. And in fact, when I've tried to convince different secular people that their lives are meaningless without God, and they're all disagreeing with me at first, this happened like 3-4 times, I show them this quote, shuts them up instantly. Now, what about the Bible? What does the Bible have to say about this? If you go back to the Old Testament, to the book of Ecclesiastes, here's what the author says. The fate of the sons of men and the fate of the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place. All come from the dust, and all return to the dust. That's crazy to read that from the Bible. That reads like one of these modern existentialist philosophers, but yet that's the Old Testament authors. And that's kind of depressing, but that's true. Like, mankind is no different from a swarm of mosquitoes on atheism. We all are just accidentally spat up, and we all die. We fade away like a flicker. I imagine human life as just like, imagine a room that's dark forever. The light flicks on for a second accidentally, and then shuts back off in a moment, and then darkness forever after that. It's like, did that light even really turn on? It did, but was it meaningful? Would it have even mattered if it didn't? It's like, if humans are just going to die, why did it even matter if we even existed in the first place? Now, very quickly, because the purpose of this talk is to show how bad life is without God, we'll talk about how these answers change with God. Think about our origin. We're intentionally created and loved into being by the King of Kings. The King, that perfect being who needs nothing, but desires to bring us into being so he can give us the gift of himself. That's why we're here. The opposite of an accident. What about our identity? We're an adopted son or daughter of the Most High who bears his image and have infinite moral worth. So just each and every one of us is worth more than all of the billions of the animals on the planet put together, and worth more than the entire rest of creation, each one of us, because we have infinity. Morality, good really does exist. Love is real. It's not just chemicals. It's an intentional choice, and sacrifice means something. And our suffering isn't all for nothing. it means something. It's ultimately redeemed, and it can allow us to become closer to the God who suffers with us. Meaning, there's a reason for why we exist. We're not just here for no reason. We're here to know, love, and serve God in this life, and to enjoy his presence forever in the next. And then destiny. Think about how Paul describes heaven. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, nor has the mind of man imagined what God has prepared for those who love him. That's what's waiting for us. That's our destiny. No matter how amazing we think of heaven, the most amazing conception of heaven we can have, the real heaven, is infinitely better than that. That's what awaits us. This is life if God exists, and if Christianity is true. That's the length that God was willing to go for us. And this is what he has in store for us. Something so marvelous that he's willing to do that for us, both to unlock that and to show us how much he loves us, to stir up that desire to pursue him. What a stark and remarkable difference between this and life without God. It doesn't get any more different. You cannot have a greater contrast. And so the next time somebody asks you for what difference God makes in life, now you'll have the answer. He makes all the difference. Now, reality might just be a cold, dark place. We may not have fuzzy feelings. We may be actually dark and depressing. So even if God does make a difference, there's still a question of whether or not God exists. So that's the next question. Does God exist? Which we'll talk about next week. And spoiler alert, he does. Thank you.